Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken, executive editor at the Mises Institute. And we're going to talk about home ownership today. That is for sale housing, not homelessness, not rental housing so much. But to do that, I've brought on our guest, Christopher Calton. And he was on a couple of months ago to talk about the issue of homelessness. And we briefly touched on home ownership, but I thought it would be nice to come back to the issue of how do we increase home ownership if that's something we want to do? Would the markets do that? How much is the government involved in affecting home ownership rates? All that sort of stuff. Now, Chris is the research fellow in housing and homelessness at the Independent Institute. He received his PhD in history at the University of Florida, where his research focused on the history of the corporation. You can find some of his work on that topic and other topics at the Mises Institute. Just go to Mises.org and search for Christopher Calton, and his archive should come right up. Well, Chris, let's talk about home ownership. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I think the last episode worked out a lot, right, in terms of really addressing some of the real day-to-day issues, the specific policies that affect homelessness. And I think we can do some similar stuff with home ownership. Now, I think with you, we'll focus mostly on the aspect of home ownership that relates to things like subsidies, regulations, fiscal policy. There's a whole other side of home ownership that we can talk about in detail in relation to monetary policy. And I'll talk about that a little bit, but that's not supposed to be the focus of this particular episode. Because we can certainly talk about how monetary inflation drives up housing prices. That's certainly something that's going to be underlying all of this. But there are other issues as well that are very much involved in home prices and home ownership and all those sorts of issues. And we don't hear in our circles at the Mises Institute, because there's so much focus on monetary policy, we don't hear about that stuff as much. Sure. And so I think really just to get started in terms of what is the deal with home ownership right now. If in recent years, it seems if you're already a homeowner, you're doing all right. You can see this in certainly people who are of a certain age and bought homes 20 years ago. Many of these people own multiple houses. And you can see, and this of course gets us right back, we're coming right back to the monetary issue, where in recent years, due to so much monetary inflation, asset price inflation, and so on, it seems that if you already own a house or you own a bunch of houses, you're doing fine. Your net worth is up because housing prices are up. But I think we could start off by asking ourselves, what if you're not someone who already owned a home in recent years? So if we're looking at people who want to become first-time home buyers, that is, they're currently renters, what issues are those people facing right now? Are they facing abundance? Are prices out of reach for these people? What percentage of these people really think? I mean, I don't know. I don't know that exact numbers exist, right? We're just speaking generally here. How do people who don't own a home yet feel about the issue of home ownership? And should we regard this as something where home ownership is becoming more available, or is this something that's becoming less affordable with each passing day? What do you think?
Well, housing costs have gone up significantly since 2020. There was a skyrocketing of like the median home costs, nationally speaking, around 2020 until about 2022. It's dropped a little bit since then, but not back down to 2020 levels. So, just speaking nationally, yes, it is harder to buy a home for the first time than it was. My wife and I were lucky. We bought our house right in 2020. And and this was in Florida, and we didn't pay very much for it. It wasn't in a city. And like the value of the home doubled in like a year because everybody was flocking into Florida during COVID. And then home prices started falling again not too long after that because it's very easy to build in Florida. So that kind of brought it back down a little bit. But what we saw in 2020 was even in those states where housing prices are cheapest, those tended to be the same states that people were flocking to from the high housing cost states like New York and California. They're flocking into places like Florida and Texas and Tennessee. And so housing costs there suddenly went up because it still takes time to build, right? You can't do it instantly. And so nationally speaking, home prices skyrocketed from 2020 to 2022 because of that migration, people voting with their feet and going to these states and buying houses very, very rapidly. But that's starting to level out in those areas. So the question is, how are first-time home buyers able to get a home in this country? Well, it depends on where you're living. All right. If you're in California, if you're in Hawaii, Washington, Massachusetts, a home is going to cost well north of $500,000 for a typical home, right? Just a standard home, median home price in Hawaii. I mean, part of this is because of the wildfire, but in Hawaii, median home price is nearing $1 million. In California, it's over $700,000. Washington and Massachusetts, it's over $600,000 for a median home price. And, the proviso to this as well, especially for people moving and looking at cost of living websites like I had to do when I moved from Florida to Arizona, is median home price in the state doesn't factor in other things like square footage, when the house was built, right? The median home in California is much more expensive than the median home in Florida, but it's also much smaller and much older. And so these factors don't always come across in just the median home prices when we're looking at these states. But then if in a lot of areas in this country, housing is still quite affordable. In the South and in the Midwest in particular, housing is still very, very affordable. Midwest, it's especially because there's not as much density, and that's true in much of the South, but even Florida and Texas, like states that would be the best kind of more red state comparisons to California and New York, where housing costs are much higher. The median home cost in Texas is about $300,000. In Florida, it's a little higher. It's about $400,000. But both of these are below the national average, despite having several large cities where housing is usually more expensive. And that's true in Texas and Florida as well. Housing is more expensive in cities, but Houston and Tampa compared to Los Angeles or Boston or New York City, of course, it's much, much cheaper. So there's still many areas in the country where you can afford to be a first-time home buyer. And what's going to happen, I think, as we see this trend continue, is more people are going to be flocking to those areas. The bigger problem, like from a socioeconomic level, is the fact that the places where housing is most expensive are historically the places where there's the most opportunities for career advancement, wealth accumulation. San Francisco with Silicon Valley, New York, this just economic hub of the economic capital of the country for more than 100 years now. We have so much opportunity in those areas, but people are being priced out away from them. So instead, people are increasingly moving to these cheaper housing areas where there's not as much opportunity. And what this means is that the total wealth of this country is that much lower because we're not able to get people to move to higher productivity areas. But what's changing instead is those areas where housing is cheaper are becoming higher productivity. The South has surpassed the Northeast economically just in the past few months for the first time ever in American history. And this is a big part of the reason why. You can afford labor there. It's a place where businesses are increasingly going to start looking to take their operations so that they can find workers at a reasonable rate.
Yes, well, as I've noticed that it's pretty remarkable from someone who doesn't remember the early 20th century when all of the economic powerhouses were far up north. in places with terrible weather, like Buffalo, New York, or Pittsburgh, or Cleveland, or these sorts of places. Detroit, absolutely, right? And
lowest housing costs in the country now out of any city is Detroit because half their population left after 2008, right?
But of course, in the 40s and 50s, that was where you wanted to move because that's where all the highly productive, best paying jobs were. And that totally changed in the 70s, 80s, and 90s as the Sun Belt became a thing and people started to move. But as you note, right, it takes time for the capital to move, for the economy to truly shift, and for all the productive jobs to move to that new place. But it seems that down south, the economy is responding. And so, right, there's housing up north. But as you note, a lot of it's very affordable now because it's old and the population has declined. Down south, it seems it's a different situation. There are a lot of people moving there, but you commented in your own comments a minute ago that it's fairly easy to build housing in Florida. So it seems like maybe
and not just housing too. It's easier to build, like businesses that want to build plants or headquarters or whatever. Right now, like Scottsdale, Arizona, an hour from where I live, this wealthy suburb of Phoenix, there's a company. I forget what they manufacture. Tasers. They manufacture tasers, and they're trying to build a facility in Scottsdale. But because housing is so expensive there, they're actually backing a bill now that would remove the referendum power among just Arizona citizens to block these kinds of developments. Right. So it's not just that you can build housing there, it's that you can build businesses there. You can build anything there because housing without jobs doesn't do much good. Right. That's Detroit. And then, businesses without housing, like you get with the tech industry in San Francisco, makes it really hard to get workers. So you got to be able to build both. And that's the key. That's the key point.
Right. I mean, that's the question, right? Is when we were talking about homelessness, part of the issue was simply having housing available, right? We noted in that discussion that there's also an element of mental illness and drug addiction and things like that that can be a factor. It isn't necessarily a factor, but can be a factor. So supply is an issue here as well, right? Everybody's talking about how we need people with higher income and we need to supplement incomes and that sort of thing. But historically, the issue of affordability has been addressed with simply greater supply of something, right? So it seems like there are at least some parts of the country, my impression is that during the last housing bubble, even in places that are known for high regulation, they were still building a lot of housing like on the fringes of the metro area. So here in Colorado, for example, drive till you qualify was very much a live slogan that applied to real life, and that there were people who would drive an hour outside the city center, and there was a lot of affordable housing out there. And that worked for a lot of people. Yep, it added to your commute time, and it wasn't ideal, but you could get in home ownership by driving till you qualified. And I got the impression that that was even true in places like in Southern California, and so possibly not Hawaii, where you never hear about much home production there. But my impression now is that it's even become tightened up in many states like California, where it's harder and harder to build even out on the fringes of the metro. I could be wrong, but it would seem that supply is an issue, but that it's not even in many states. Supply even seems less available than it was in the past in terms of addressing the affordability issue.
Yeah. Well, there still are pockets of areas in California where, at least compared to the rest of the state, housing is more affordable, where the median home price might be like $400,000. But that's low in California. You go to Mississippi and that's that's enormous, right? You go to Florida, that's pretty high in most areas of Florida. So it's all relative, I suppose. But it speaks to the point that a lot of what affects housing costs are local policies. State policies do it at the second level, and then federal policy has very little impact on housing prices. Trump's lumber tariffs will raise housing prices. You mentioned monetary policy. They will, but for the most part, it's state and local policy especially. And this is why we see such wide variation in housing costs between even different areas within a state and then between different states, of course.
we did touch upon the issue of trying to make it easier to buy one in terms of income. So something that has come up is this issue of, well, we'll just subsidize. Now, the federal government already subsidizes home ownership in a variety of indirect ways, right? And I had, a couple of weeks ago, I had Alex Pollock on here. We talked about how Fannie and Freddie are buying up loans in the secondary market, and that is an indirect way of subsidizing home ownership. FHA is an indirect way of doing it by providing essentially mortgage insurance with government subsidy of a sort. But now we hear about things like we're going to just directly subsidize homeownership by providing government loans in the form of down payment assistance, or maybe even grants. I don't know. They could think up any number of things. The question is, will that work? Will just giving more money to people for purposes of buying homes result in making homes more affordable?
I think it could, right? If you're talking about down paying assistance, I think it could increase home ownership rates, but that's not the complete question, right? Because in the asterisk to the down payment assistance question is we haven't had a fully concrete plan. What we had is like a campaign proposal where a lot of the details weren't really fleshed out. But what we got from Kamala Harris when she was campaigning, and this was one of the things that she suggested in her platform, was down payment assistance, is it looked a lot like federal subsidies for student loans, right? So in the 90s, the federal government started subsidizing student loans, and then in 2008, 2009, it was pretty much nationalized industry. All student loans are issued by the Department of Education, and it did lead to increasing enrollments, right? And so by the same standard, I think down payment assistance could lead to an increase in home ownership. But the trade-off with the increasing enrollments in the subsidized student loans is skyrocketing tuition that has gone up dramatically faster than the rate of inflation, right? Because you give people more money and you say you can only use this money for this one product or service, well, then demand for that's going to go up and the price is going to go up with that, right? Student loan assistance, like subsidized student loans, they didn't solve the supply issue of university education. They just subsidized demand, so tuition skyrocketed. With that, administrative bloat skyrocketed, right? And so there's also a lot more inefficiency there. And then, of course, we have the student debt crisis. We have record numbers of defaults on student loans. It's become a major, major crisis. So when you look at down payment assistance, I think it would be similar. Would it help more people become first-time home buyers? Probably would, but we're going to have these long-term consequences of this with spiraling debt. And a point that I make about down payment assistance, and of course this can depend on the details of the bill, but when you make a down payment on a house, you put $100,000 or whatever it is down on a house, the amount of a loan that you're able to qualify for is greater. It increases by more than the amount of down payment. It's a multiple of that down payment, right? If you can put $20,000 extra down in a down payment, you might get approved for $100,000 extra on your mortgage. And so just like with the student loan crisis, you get all this money for tuition goes up. It's just going to ultimately help raise the cost of housing even farther, and eventually get to the point where it's not really helping anybody at all. It might initially, but it's going to create significant problems in the home mortgage market, another debt crisis, just like we see with student loans. That's what I think would happen. So whatever small victories you might get right off the bat are going to be undone in a few years by all these other problems.
Well, and I guess it would just also make home ownership more attractive, even if you're on the fence, right? If you're kind of relatively indifferent to, do I pursue home ownership or do I pursue a rental? If there's just this money hanging out there in terms of subsidized loans for down payments. So that would push you then over the line into home ownership. And obviously then that would push up the home ownership rate because fewer people would be renting. Does it actually help reduce the actual prices in real terms? That's another question, I suppose. And yeah, I do think the student loan situation is analogous. But so back to the issue of regulation, and you've done some work on this as well. This is the issue of zoning and just really not allowing markets to determine for themselves where home ownership should be built. Right now, we have to note that home ownership is not necessarily single-family homes. It could be townhouses. It could be attached housing of various types, right? Which would include townhouses, duplexes, triplexes, condos, even. But often it seems that local governments, they're trying to favor for sale housing, but of a certain type. Usually single family housing seems to be the favored type of housing, which is less affordable than attached housing. Also, this just could have the effect of perhaps, I don't know, maybe you can give me a few more details, in terms of reducing overall building of for sale housing. But it seems that zoning relates back also to our homelessness issue, and the fact of zoning, like so many other regulations, is in part seems to be a product of current homeowners' efforts to protect the value of their home. They want to prop up their home prices and ensure, right? They don't want a factory too close to their house. They don't want poor people in their neighborhood, right? This is why it's so hard to build like very inexpensive housing for low income people, because nobody wants that anywhere near them. So they use the power of the state to prevent that from happening. But of course, if you just had a flood of new housing, that would seem to bring down the effect or the price of your currently owned property as well, because now there's more supply. So would you say that zoning is an issue here as well, and has it affected really just the overall availability of housing?
Yeah, so what you're referring to, by the way, is the home voter hypothesis. I was looking for that book on my bookshelf because the author is slipping my mind. But it's the home voter hypothesis is this theory that the limitations on home building are policies that can be best explained under the hypothesis that people are just voting in their own self-interest to protect the value of their homes once you have a homeowner. And one of the reasons this concept is important, and I know this isn't directly answering your question about zoning, which I'll get to, but the reason this concept is important, this home voter hypothesis, is because when you have some proposal for some new construction, whether it be housing or something else, the only constituents there that can weigh in on that proposal when you have things like popular referendums or NIMBYism, not in my backyard, protests, things like that, challenging the housing, are people who already live in that community, right? So if you have a developer that wants to build an apartment complex, this happens all the time in California, right? You have developers, they want to build an apartment complex, and then they get a bunch of homeowners, usually homeowners in the area, that organize together these neighborhood groups, and they go and they challenge the permits or they sue under environmental law or things like that to prevent it from being built. And they'll give all kinds of justification about neighborhood character, and we don't want we don't want formerly homeless people living near us if it's that kind of housing or something like this, right? They give all these justifications, but at the end of the day, what we find is that really it can be best explained by people just trying to protect the value of their homes. And the people whose interest is in having that built, they don't have a constituency there usually. If you're living in another state trying to move into San Francisco, right, you don't get to weigh in on those popular referendums. You don't get to go and give your side. You're not represented there. You're disenfranchised, right? So the voting, the people in power in different localities are disproportionately homeowners, and the people that would demand the homes they're blocking are usually, more often than not, they're not enfranchised in the area. So it's a very, very important issue where I think it does explain a great deal of this, and it's bipartisan. We see these problems more in blue areas, but I remember reading in Arizona, like in Phoenix, people trying to block some apartments there, and there was, somebody there talking about how this was socialism. If they were going to come and build this privately on their own private property, this would be socialism. So you do find this both among, the red and the blue in these areas. It's more generational probably than partisan when you get down to that, like just local opposition level. But as far as zoning goes,
I just know, by the way, that it looks like the author of this book is William Fischel.
Yes, William Fischel. God,
okay.
It is. It would have come to me in the shower.
The full title, for anyone who's interested out there, and I haven't heard of this book before, so I'm very interested. The Home Voter Hypothesis, How Home Values Influence Local Government Taxation, School Finance, and Land Use Policies. So, if you're interested in this topic at all, that sounds like essential reading. But yeah, go ahead, Chris. You had a little bit more to add to that.
But well, I was just going to get to your zoning question. Zoning, when it was first done, I think the biggest target on zoning was apartments. It wasn't about protecting home values because this was the 1920s. The Supreme Court ruled nationally that zoning was permissible, essentially. So it was 19 teens is when you start seeing the first real comprehensive zoning laws. And then the Supreme Court, I think in 1926, ruled and upheld zoning constitutionally. And at that time, home value, like people's net worth wasn't tied up in their homes in the same way. So at the outset, I don't think zoning was done to protect home values. I think today a lot of protection of zoning is done for that reason, right? That's since the 70s on, basically. I think we've seen a lot of that. But at the time, it was about keeping undesirables out of your neighborhood. And those undesirables usually lived in apartments, and apartment complexes were very much a target of this. The Supreme Court decision upholding zoning was not a contest over an apartment building, but in the majority of opinion upholding the zoning law, and this was an Ohio law that it was dealing with, the author of the majority of opinion gave these lengthy diatribes about apartment complexes in there when the case didn't even have anything to do with apartments. So it kind of tells you, here's the real motivation behind this is we don't want apartments because we don't want the kind of people that live in apartments, whether it be at the time, a lot of that was very racial, and today a lot of it's income level, it's the mentally ill, it's the formerly homeless. Like we're just concerned about all these things. And so what we find in zoning, this is where, places like San Jose, California, more than 90% of the city is zoned, residential areas are zoned exclusively for single family homes, right? And we find this all over the place. Maricopa County, where Phoenix, Arizona is, near where I live, it's more than 90% of the county is zoned exclusively in residential areas for single family homes. And so what they've essentially done is they've criminalized inherently affordable housing typologies. This would be apartment complex, townhomes, mobile homes. Apartments are the biggest one there because they're the easiest ones to build affordable because you can build up. But they've essentially criminalized inherently affordable housing typologies. So it's very easy where I live to build single family homes. They're all over the place. Construction in Arizona, it's not quite as vigorous as Florida, where I moved from, but a lot of construction, but it's almost all single family homes. Most rental areas are just little small single family homes because in so many areas, that's all you can legally build. And so it does have a limiting effect on supply. It constrains supply, even though it's easy to build those homes. It's not as easy to do it as inexpensively and as quickly as it would if you're building a 1,000-unit apartment complex.
Well, and then they intervene with other types of zoning as well, other regulations in the sense of, right, if you're only allowing the construction of single-family homes, well, what you're going to get then is people renting the single-family homes because that's the only housing around. And because they'll only allow housing of a certain price level to be built, now you have to get 5 or 6 adults crammed into a single-family home in order to afford living there when they might have been able to just rent 3 apartments as opposed to cramming a bunch of people into this one single family house. So then, we can't allow that. So then we have to introduce different types of zoning that everyone has to be related in the house. And it just adds, one regulation adds to another. And the historical aspect too, of how people felt about housing in the past too, is very interesting because you encounter these in the teens and 20s. I did an article several years ago about the phenomenon of the boarding house and the residential hotel in America. And of course, tons of Americans used to live in these living situations.
And let me add something, just a quick interruption there, is those single room occupancy hotels that you're referring to, until roughly like the late 70s, if you were considered homeless, what it predominantly meant is that you were living in one of those single room occupancy hotels. Like the term homeless as we understand it today really wasn't how we understood it until about the 1980s, right? So it was not being part of a community. So most homeless people before the 80s or before the late 70s they had a place to live, a roof over their head, but it was in these single room occupancy hotels. But anyway, go on. I just wanted to add that.
Well, and this takes us directly to the issue of zoning, right? Because there were efforts to get rid of those sorts of residential hotels because they were associated with undesirables, essentially. And you had,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
Well, they were considered like urban renewal requires the bulldozing of these.
That's what I was going to get at. Urban renewal, which started under the FDR administration, it used to be called slum clearance. So some people date the start of urban renewal in like the 60s but it was really just a Lyndon administration kind of, marketing thing. It's like, let's not call it slum clearance. That sounds bad. Let's call it urban renewal. But it was the same policy. And it started back under FDR. But it really became vigorous in the 50s and say it reached its high point in the 60s under Lyndon Johnson. Every president between FDR and Johnson, including Eisenhower, so it wasn't just a Democrat thing, every president between FDR and Johnson signed some urban renewal bill, but at least one, some of them more than one. And what they did under urban renewal was they went and destroyed all of these low-income homes. And what they were supposed to do is replace it with better, higher quality, affordable homes for the same people who were living there. But of course, this ignored the fact that you're massively displacing hundreds of thousands of families were displaced by this. This was a massive, destructive act by the federal government through subsidies and grants at the local level, but it was by the federal government. There's a book on it called The Federal Bulldozer. It's a very old book, but so I think urban renewal is still going on when it was written. But it was massive destruction of low-income housing, displacement of poor people, to the tune of hundreds of thousands of families. And then they were supposed to have a replacement with other homes that were nicer and still affordable, but they ended up being nicer and less affordable. So they just ended up moving more people into the remaining affordable areas and leading to more density, more overcrowding, and more of these problems. And then they would replace them with these nicer luxury apartments that then would have a bunch of like upper middle class people applying for them because of all these amenities. And then a lot of times it wasn't even to replace homes. They did not replace the homes they did build did not match the quantity of homes destroyed. And so this is where we started seeing homelessness in the modern sense was a response to this, right? Because now people who are homeless are really just living on the streets. That wasn't very common before urban renewal, before the massive destruction of these homes. It also, by the way, coincided with deinstitutionalization, where the idea under the Kennedy administration was, well, the mentally ill people that are institutionalized, they're going to receive community care in these community care centers, but it's going to be outpatient care. But the homes that they were supposed to live in were the ones that were actively being destroyed under urban renewal, right? And so these policies worked with each other greatly, or I was going to say increased, but it really created the modern homelessness crisis. And then, ironically, the response to urban renewal, when people started turning against it, and this was led by a woman named Jane Jacobs, who was a progressive reformer, who very, very respectably, like she deserves credit for standing up against urban renewal, but her solution was community planning. And so this was where she started this movement, or really kind of like was the unofficial leader of this movement, to kind of like democratize the planning process at the local level, where, you know, just regular citizens in a neighborhood could stand up and weigh in on zoning decisions. And this is what led to like the NIMBY phenomena that we have today, where residents can block developments in many areas of this country, especially in California. They can just block it through lawsuits and things like this. This was all an outgrowth of this. So it was kind of ironic, because the urban renewal, they just destroyed all of these low-income homes, and then the response to stop urban renewal also created the mechanism that prevented the replacement of those homes. And we're still dealing with this today.
Well, and single-family homes got caught up on this as well, because you had people renting single-room occupancy sort of situations in the residential hotels. And that was in your more dense areas, your more urban areas. But you also had a similar phenomenon that existed out in the less dense areas. And these were simply the boarding houses, where people were renting out a room in a single family house. Now, boarding houses existed also in the cities, right? Where you a family might own a small apartment building or like a triplex or something, and the family lived there, and then they would rent out parts of the building. But this existed in the suburbs as well. We have a house, we rent out one or two of the bedrooms. You hear about this in old fiction all the time, right? Papa died at war, mom needs to take on a boarder in order to pay the mortgage or to pay the bills. right? This was a common way for families to make ends meet, was to rent out one of the bedrooms, and also you offered not just room but also board, maybe, where the woman of the house would create meals, usually dinner, for the renter as well. And there was a time in America in the first quarter of the 20th century where 50% of Americans had lived in a boarding house situation at some point. So common for affordable housing, for people getting their start, where they just rented out a bedroom. But the progressives at the time, and you can find quotations to this effect, where they hated the boarding house. They created some sort of like both cultural and legislative campaign against boarding houses. One of the quotations I include in the article was to the effect of, well, people living together communally in a house like this turns people into communists. So we should be adopting policies where everybody's basically forced to live alone in their own unit that they rent or buy themselves. So basically, hey, it's too affordable to let people rent out a room or do something of this thing that the market had freely provided in terms of affordable housing. So let's get rid of that. So then that manifested also in terms of legislation. And one aspect of zoning then was, we're not going to allow any more, I guess people now call them mother-in-law units and that sort of thing, where there's a part of the house where you can rent it out easily, and the person there has maybe an exterior door where the person can come and go. But that stuff was extremely common 100 years ago, but then was quashed by changes in zoning and new efforts to get rid of undesirables. Even though people who boarded in your house, you had total say over who got to be living in your house. But we got rid of all that, and that greatly reduced affordability as well, but also changes the whole calculus of single family construction, what gets built, who gets to live in it, and all the rules about what can you do with a single family house. So yet just another layer of regulation that goes on top of single family housing and construction.
You know, I'm going to recommend a book to you that you're going to love, Ryan, if you haven't already read it. It's The Poor Side of Town and Why We Need It by Howard Hughes-Ock. And what it deals exactly with what you're talking about. What this book discusses is it's not just like the widow trying to make ends meet. It's the boarding house kind of phenomena, or people renting out a room of their home. This was a way that low income people were able to not just make ends meet, but build generational wealth, right? Because they had ownership of a house, and they were able to secure that ownership financially by boarding somebody when they maybe couldn't otherwise afford it. But then they had this asset that this owned, and this was the way to move up the economic ladder. And this was another thing that was destroyed in urban renewal, because it wasn't just rental properties, like it wasn't just apartment buildings that were being cleared and like slum clearance programs. It was people who actually owned their homes were having, because they were in the wrong neighborhood where some politician wanted to build a stadium or something. It was supposed to be to help the poor, but that's really what it was doing often, was just making room for some big monument to some overlord in a city or whatever. And so they would actually like use eminent domain, of course, and destroy homes that people owned with these piddly compensation. And what they would do is, I mean, it was so nefarious. What they would often do to lower the value of the properties that they were seizing through eminent domain is they would run out everybody they could. They would run out businesses from these neighborhoods, make it impossible, and basically engineer the lowering of property values in that area through these policies. So then when they seized these homes through eminent domain, they would then pay them, the value of the property at that time after they destroyed the value of it by running everybody else out. I mean, it was just really horrible. And so what it did was it took people that were actually moving up the economic ladder through home ownership, often supported by having a boarder, and they forced them to be renters in a dwindling supply of rental units. I mean, it was just incredibly like evil what they did, just destroying generational wealth for hundreds of thousands of people in this way. But that's what people used to do. They used to take on a boarder, and that allowed them to become homeowners. Most rental units at that time were owner occupied. That's what Hughes-Ock talks about in the book I recommended, is they were usually owner occupied. We still see this a lot in California, where a lot of people try to rent out homes because home prices are so expensive there that they're able to do that. But then they have all these renter laws, especially with COVID, that make it where they don't even want to do that. I mean, it's just becoming a crisis where one progressive policy leads to this problem, and then progressives tried to solve it with another policy that just creates new problems, like Jane Jacobs and her, community planning movement and things like this, rent control. I mean, it's just progressive policies trying to solve older problems from older progressive policies, and they just keep making the problems worse.
Well, so much of this is now so baked into the housing and what gets done in our whole view of housing and where it should be and how it should be used that we don't even notice that there's so much government regulation involved in it anymore. It's part of the landscape now. So yeah. It's become invisible. It's blended in to the background in a way that it's not evident to most people that the whole system has been centrally planned by government planners for many decades at this point. Now, really then, because there's so much involved, so many layers of everything, I guess we just end with a question of what's some easy things. We're not even trying to solve the whole problem. What's like a first couple of steps that maybe we could take in terms of addressing some of these issues for homeownership affordability?
I think there's the national question and there's the California question, because we haven't even touched on many of the things that drive up home costs in California and other like blue states. I mean, I'm most knowledgeable on California, of course, but a lot of these policies are similar in like Hawaii and New York, Washington, Oregon. But in there's no simple answer. There's no one thing that can be done. You have to do a combination of things because there's a combination of things that work together to raise home prices. But nationally speaking, the most general answer is zoning liberalization, or really zoning abolition, right? I'm a zoning abolitionist. I think you probably are too. Houston is the only major city in the country that has no zoning code at all. In fact, voters reject. This is an interesting point. Zoning was not put to a popular vote, to my knowledge, anywhere in the country except for Houston. But it was put to a popular vote 3 different times, and voters rejected it 3 different times. And so Houston is the only major city with no zoning code. Every other city, to my knowledge, that adopted zoning, they did it as like a backroom, decision by city leaders. It was not a democratic thing. Now, it'd be very difficult to democratically abolish zoning because it's so entrenched and people don't even question it. But Houston has no zoning code. Their median housing cost is like $300,000, and the median house there is going to be like twice as nice as the median home in California. And this is, I think, the 5th largest city in the country, right? This is not like a minor city. It's very, very significant, very, very affordable housing without the Detroit model. Like, this is a growing city, yet remains one of the most affordable cities in the country. And it's because they have no zoning. It's primarily because they have no zoning. So zoning abolition is the best thing you can do. Just do away with it. But short of that, realistically, most people aren't going to take that more radical solution. So zoning liberalization, there's a few things that I say that cities should focus on to solve the housing crisis. The first one is to abolish single-family zoning areas, right? This is where you're just outright prohibiting these inherently affordable housing typologies, particularly apartments. So get rid of single-family zoning. But that's not sufficient, because there's a lot of other things that have a roundabout effect of essentially enforcing single-family zoning. A big one is minimum parking requirements. The book High Cost of Free Parking by Donald Shoup. Is it Donald? I think it's Donald Shoup. High Cost of Free Parking. He actually just died recently, sadly. But very, very famous book in urban planning circles, where he just talks about the absurdity of parking requirements, where you'll have an apartment complex that has to have like 3 parking spaces per unit or something like this. And all these parking requirements in cities kind of have a very similar effect of preventing development. They raise the cost of housing, and they lower the rate at which new housing is added quite significantly. So repeal parking requirements. Similar things would be floor area ratio requirements and minimum lot sizes and building height limitations. All three of these general policies, very common in zoning codes, are designed to constrain the size of buildings, right? Building height requirements. We have these in DC. Nothing can be taller than the Washington Monument, but rent there is several $1,000s a month for a pretty small apartment. Used to have friends that had an apartment in DC. I think they paid $3,000 a month for it, and it was just tiny. It was nice, but it was tiny, right? Because you can't build up. San Francisco's like that as well. You can't build up in most areas of the city. Minimum lot sizes. There are areas, Boston, which is one of the most expensive housing cities in the country. They have areas where minimum lot sizes are an acre or more. California has areas where lots have to be 60 acres to preserve farmland, right? So these things, doing away with these regulations, minimum lot sizes, minimum floor area requirements, and building height limitations would be a good one. And then just generally decriminalizing inherently affordable housing typologies, make it legal to build apartments in particular would go a long way. Apartments are the easiest way to build affordable housing in high quantity for people. And it's an important point that even things like luxury apartments, everybody moves up when you build this. This is a common misconception among people, is they think, oh, well, we got to build affordable apartments, and all these luxury high rises, they're all that's being built. Well, that's because all these building regulations make it so expensive to build that the only thing that's profitable would be like luxury apartments. But even in that case, the people that move into them create vacancies elsewhere that allows everybody to move up a rung in the ladder. So in their study after study that show this, building housing at any income level lowers the cost of housing at every income level. And that's such an important point to understand, right? So zoning liberalization would be at a national level. It's done locally, of course, but just generalizing at the national level, zoning liberalization would move the needle toward affordable housing more. Now, in places like San Francisco, I think something like permit requirements there are more important. Every permit in San Francisco, every housing permit is subject to discretionary approval, which means that city planners can deny a permit on any grounds that they see fit subjectively. And this is actually not uncommon in California, where it's like just the style of the neighborhood is regulated, where it's like, oh, the architecture is going to be too different. We're not going to allow that to be built here. So these like stylistic, subjective, discretionary approval processes are very, very horrible. San Francisco is just unique because it subjects everything to discretionary permit requirements. So I think that's actually more important in places like that. Is the average time to get a permit in Houston is about 10 days. If you want a permit for an apartment building in San Francisco, it's measured in years, like more than 2 years for the average time to get a permit. And many times it takes, it can take more than a decade. There are many such cases where it takes more than a decade to get all your approvals, right? So that's very important. And then in many areas, California and many other states also have environmental laws that impose requirements on environmental review. And what this does, not only does it raise the cost of building housing, but it's the most common avenue for people that want to impede developments and delay them, is they sue under usually environmental laws, and now often under historic preservation, which in California also falls under the environmental law for some nonsensical reason. So they'll sue under these laws and block development. So in areas like California, Hawaii, New York, Oregon and Washington, places like this, you need to do more than just liberalize zoning. You need to make or institute a very simple and transparent permitting process in which discretionary permits are no longer a thing. Ministerial permits, where if you meet the regulatory code, you're just automatically issued a permit. That's what's done in places like Texas and Florida. They need that, and then they need to just repeal these environmental laws that give people ammunition to block developments. So the most expensive areas, just one thing is not usually going to solve the problem. You got to tackle all of these different problems that are inflating housing costs.
Well, what gets me is that in the end, when a lot of the people on the left look at the lack of affordability in these places, what they're going to say is capitalism failed us.
Capitalism is failing in California. But socialism's working great in Texas, apparently, right? It's like, that's what I always get, like, really, capitalism's failing in the least capitalist areas, but it's working pretty well in the more free market states like Florida and Texas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, like, I mean, all the southern states, much more free market oriented, much more affordable housing, even in cities like Houston and Tampa and Dallas and Austin. And these are, cities that vote Democrat a lot most of the times, but they're in states that just as state policy, keep this stuff from getting to the California level, even when they're blue cities. So I think capitalism is failing so much that the least capitalist areas are doing the worst. That's the pattern.
Well, with that, we'll have to wrap up this episode of Radio Rothbard. Thank you, Christopher Calton, for joining me today. Thank you all out there for tuning in. We'll be back. Me. And we'll be back next week with more here at, if you're not already subscribing, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is Mises Media. And you can always get all of this at Mises.org. That's MISES.org. And you can subscribe for weekly emails at the top if you like. So thank you all. We'll see you next time. One last thing, Radio Rothbard fans. Before you go, I want to make sure you know about our April 26 event in Phoenix, Arizona. And this one's called Our Enemy, the Bureaucracy. This one features Dr. Robert Malone, Tom Woods, and Tom DiLorenzo as they discuss the psychological operations and bureaucratic control, the madness of COVID-era public health, and the corruption and hypocrisy of our federal bureaucracy. Tickets are $100 for Mises members and $120 for non-members. You can register now at Mises.org/Phoenix25. And you have a chance to win a free ticket to the event if you enter the raffle at Mises.org/Phoenix Raffle 25 by April 1st.